Hi, I'm Ben Smith. I'm a reporter for the Politico, which is a political paper out of Washington, D.C. I cover the Democrats who are running for president for the Politico, and I write a blog there. I'm talking to you from the basement of New York City Hall, a press room here, and I work out of New York, so excuse the background noise. Over to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Ben. I'm Glenn Greenwald with Salon.com. I'm a contributing writer there, and I also write a blog there that covers political and legal and media issues. And in particular, it seems like lately one of the things I cover is the Politico, which is what has led Ben and I here to have this discussion about some of the issues I've been writing about that concerns his columns in the Politico and some more general issues. I just want to start off by saying that we tried during this session, it was our maiden blogging head session about a week ago, and had some technical difficulties after about 30 minutes of covering.
I had some technical difficulties.
Right, well, we did jointly. And so we talked about several of the specific stories that Ben had written that led to some of the extremes, like the now infamous or famous John Edwards haircut story. And some of the other stories about Barack Obama and Bill Richardson. So when I
won this argument, and it's totally lost to history. It's really too bad.
Right, it was a real shame. I was celebrating it because of the ignominious defeats I suffered. So
exactly.
Rather than try and replicate that, and it just seems kind of stilted to do that, we've agreed to talk about issues a little more broadly, and maybe it'll include some of those issues. And in fact, since that session, I've written a couple of new articles about the Politico. The Politico is interesting, I think, not just in terms of what it is, but as a media phenomenon, because it's so new, and yet its influence is mammoth, when both in absolute terms, I think, and certainly when one thinks about how new it is. And that's one of the reasons I've been focusing on it, is I think it has a lot of interesting aspects to it. And one of the issues that I wanted to begin with in particular was on Friday, I wrote a piece about the ownership and the corporate control of the Politico. There's been a lot of controversy about some of the articles the Politico has generated, most of which has been criticism that has come from, I think it's fair to say, from the left and from Bush critics.
Really from you and from Media Matters, primarily.
And I think other bloggers as well, but I think probably Media Matters and I think Fred Sargent Talking Points is written.
No, I don't think he has at all.
Okay, well, so then Media Matters and I and a few others. And I think the right has been more or less happy with the Politico. I mean, I know Hugh Hewitt has had some friendly chats with Mike Allen and I think John Harris and Matt Farr.
I could interrupt here or not, but I'll let you go. But I'm going to.
Yeah, I'm just saying, sort of setting forth my view of the world, and we can, have yours right now.
I'll sort of quietly shake my head over here.
All right, and you can pound the table too.
So go ahead.
Yes. And so and a lot of that focus has been on the article by article complaints and with a focus on the journalists like John Harris and Jim Van de Heye and Roger Simon and Mike Allen and you and a couple others. And really almost nothing has been mentioned by anyone that I have seen about the corporate ownership and the funding of the Politico. And on Friday, the day after the Politico hosted the Republican presidential debate, there was a little passage buried in Mike Allen's article in which he mentioned that the CEO and president of the Politico was Fred Ryan, who he said was the chairman of the Reagan Library. And what he didn't say, but which is also true, is that Fred Ryan was, an official in the Reagan White House for many years. And that led me to look around a little bit more and find that it's the All-Britain company that is funding the Politico almost exclusively, and that's a family that has long-time right-wing ties. So I wanted to, I guess to me, and I think to a lot of people, that would raise questions about the Politico's objectivity and what its real purpose is, that it's funded and controlled by people with clear right-wing ties. And I guess, we can start from there and see what's raised by those issues.
Okay, I mean, I guess when I did see that item, I did not think it was, I guess I thought that was weak compared to the sort of more broader issue of political journalism and sort of how it works, because I think the reason that stories on the Politico have focused on its reporters is just because it's a very reporter-driven publication. Harris and Van de Heye kind of pitched this to Albritton rather than vice versa, and then hired a bunch of people who who were very happy in their reporting jobs, not wash-ups who were looking to earn a buck joining the right-wing conspiracy. So, I mean, I think sort of from my perspective, I was a little bugged by that because I would not have left the Daily News, Mike Allen wouldn't have left Time, Harris and Van de Heye wouldn't have left what are perceived as two of the best jobs in journalism at the Washington Post, to suddenly alight on this conspiracy. So, if there's a conspiracy, I am really quite confident that none of the reporters there know what's going on. So, perhaps it's a conspiracy that we haven't been let in on. And then just secondarily, your post looked like to me it reflected maybe a couple hours of Googling, but I don't think, do you know anything about the politics of the guy who owns Albritton Communications, Robert Albritton?
I know a lot about the politics of his father. I know a lot about the CEO and president of the
Right, but you don't know anything about the
that to me seems important. I don't know anything about the son of Joe Albritton.
Here. And Fred Ryan is the CEO. He may also be the CEO of the Politico. Politico is as far as I know, it's a wholly owned subsidiary of Albritton. And he's the CEO of Albritton. He runs the business side. He signed my contract. And as far as I know, that's the only editorial. I mean, I met him once, but he's just sort of not on the editorial side of the operation. Though he did, because he's close to the Reagan family. I think he was involved in, organizing that debate. But it's like this is one of these things where you could have, or not you could have, but like where there have been stories written about the Politico where you can kind of report out, what kind of an institution is this? Is this a is Fred Ryan involved in the editorial stuff? This is something you could report out. You could call, sources at said newspaper and ask them if they talk to him about editorial stuff. And it just happens not to be the case. Not that it couldn't be the case.
Well, you don't know you don't know that John Harris and Jim Van
No, I do have secret meetings with him. No, I do not. But no, I don't know if there are secret meetings. But if there are secret. I mean, like we the staff, and I'm fairly senior staff. There are 5 or 6 of us really who were the sort of initial hires. Like we're never told about this. So it just seems implausible to me at a newspaper that there is this sort of secret behind-the-scenes conspiracy. Also, this form of argument bugs me because it's the same form of argument that was used, particularly in the 1990s, by the right to trash journalists all over the place. And Google just helped me out on this so much because I'm reading a 1998 press release from the Landmark Legal Foundation, which today, May 11th, 98, which today accused the internet magazine Salon of failing to reveal the extent to which millionaires who bankroll it are linked to President Bill Clinton and the Democratic National Committee. And it talks about Bill Hambrecht. And it's like, and then concludes.
I think it's relevant. I think it's relevant who owns Salon, and I think it's relevant who owns, any journalistic outlet, and the reason for that is obvious, that employees who work... The reason is because people who work for companies know who signs their paychecks and know that the work they do ought to be pleasing to the people who sign their paychecks. And I guess, I don't know, you keep calling it a conspiracy, which is a way of trying to take an issue that's raised and demean it.
No, it's not. Well, then, let clarify for me here. Do you think am I a dupe or am I lying to you?
No, I don't think either of those things. I'm asking questions. I think that, if Rush Limbaugh tomorrow purchased NBC News, or if Michael Moore tomorrow purchased the Los Angeles Times, I think that everyone across the spectrum would consider that to be an interesting fact. Now, and an important fact to know about.
Absolutely, but neither Bill Hambrecht nor Robert Albritton is like a career propagandist. Do you know what I mean? There's a...
Fred Ryan is a career Reaganite. You cannot say...
Reaganite? The Reagan administration ended 20 years ago.
Yeah, and his ties to the Reagan family continue. He's the president. He's obviously, according to...
He is the number 2 guy at the company. That is absolutely true. The number 2 guy at News Corp is Peter Chernin, a prominent Democrat who gives tens of thousands to the...
the number 1 guy is Rupert Murdoch. But,
exactly.
I
just think that the details matter, the facts matter. There's a reality underlying it that you can't get from this sort of quickie... I don't know, just to finish my reading here, because I love this line. Mark Levin says, from Landmark Legal, says that Salon should be viewed as just another weapon in the White House's spin arsenal. And it's just such a preposterous way to make arguments, I think. It's so easy.
Yeah, and I don't think I said it, and I wouldn't say Fred Ryan, a Reagan official, controls the Politico. Therefore, the Politico is a right-wing organ that ought not to be listened to. The point is that it's relevant information viewed in context of everything else the Politico has done. And I mean, are you aware, for example, that the person who, signed your contract and signs your paycheck and controls the employer for which you work is a longtime Reagan official and has close ties to the Reagan family? I mean, whether that's something that you're in this super ethical way able to bracket out of your work, I mean, is that something that you're aware of or were aware of when you joined the Politico?
I wasn't actually aware of it when I was hired. I met him much more recently. He was just sort of the signature on my contract initially. And I am aware of it, and but just both in my experience and in the structure of the company, he runs it. Or I don't know if maybe that's inappropriate. I don't want to get into discussing things I don't entirely know about in my own company. But the guy who owns it and really is the boss and is the guy I see much more in a hands-on way is Robert Albritton, whose politics I really don't know. My only clue to his politics is that he went to Wesleyan. And you can, and you could probably spin a whole different story out of that. But
yeah, I mean, I suppose the fact that his fortune is inherited from, a family that has long-standing right-wing ties might be relevant too. I mean, he could be. That doesn't prove anything about his politics.
But seriously, find some evidence.
I think it's relevant.
Oh, absolutely, but just just find some evidence. It's like, go report it out. Dig something up that suggests that it's true. I mean, it is sort of interesting and relevant. But all I can tell you is I have no idea what these guys' politics are,
right.
or what Mr. Albritton's politics are. So I don't. And that's great.
But we do know what Fred Ryan's politics are, right? I mean, we definitely know what Fred Ryan's politics are.
I don't. Beyond that, he worked for Reagan. I've never had a political conversation with him. I'm sure, but
that's kind of a revealing fact.
But he's not the boss. And I mean, he is.
I understand. I know what I know about.
It's just not the reality of the place. I mean, I can't really. We can move on past this, but it's just not the reality of the place.
I mean, I think there's never
which is why you ask questions like
mathematical
that.
Proof or dispositive evidence standing alone that can ever demonstrate that any particular journalistic outlet has a particular bias or a political purpose. All you can do is look at the body of evidence. So
I'm just saying you should look harder. But anyway, can we move on? Because
one piece of evidence is the ideological background of the people who own and control and fund it. And then, another piece of
you've
evidence.
got one person here. I mean, the other is that John Harris, who actually really is the guy who, runs the paper in a day-to-day way, who hired me, who's the guy I aim to please an employee, wrote the definitive and I think generally considered fairly even, at least.
Let's talk about John Harris then, because this does touch on some of the issues.
Let's move on.
I don't even talk about this. Well, okay.
Before you get me fired.
No, I mean, I'm not trying to go person by person, but I think that, if you want to make these statements that these claims about the Politico are just these wild conspiracy theories that are based on nothing more significant than the fact that the person who controls it is a Reagan operative. I mean, I think then...
Wait, the control... you just said something that isn't true. You just said something that isn't true. You're the number 2 guy in the company and not the guy I report to. You used to work for Reagan. You know absolutely nothing about the politics of my actual boss.
No, what I know about the Politico's structure is what I learned in Mike Allen's article, which is that Fred Ryan is its president and its CEO. And CEO of the Politico, and CEO
everything you know about the
infrastructure. In a company. I mean, in general. So
sure, and the CEO of News Corp is a prominent Democrat. It matters not at all, it seems to me, in that specific case. It just varies case by case. And if everything you know, as you said, about the structure of the Politico comes from a parenthetical in an article, maybe you should do more research.
Well, no, I also know that its biggest booster by far, and the person on whom it depends by far for the vast, overwhelming amount of its traffic is Matt Drudge. I know that as well.
And that's much more interesting, and let's talk about that, because I actually think, that is interesting. And I think that the stuff about this structure, just because I work there and I know what I write and I know how it's edited, is really not. I just think you're kind of on the wrong track, though I see how you're on it.
Right.
But I actually think it's more, if we can talk about, I think Drudge's kind of role on the internet is interesting, and so, and I guess, I mean, we sort of started on Drudge because you objected to, or I won't characterize it, but I did an item and was sort of the first to note that there was, in John Edwards' campaign finance filing, there was a line for 2 $400 haircuts.
Right. You
and
broke
I
that
thought this was
story.
and I spent hours and hours of research breaking the. No, I spent 15 minutes writing this up, put it on the blog in what was intended to be kind of a jokey way because I didn't think it was Watergate. Drudge picks this up. It becomes a huge. It's still haunting him. The Iowa papers were writing about it yesterday. It's sort of a big it's a conservative storyline that conservatives love. It kind of maybe dovetails in a way retrospectively with Ann Coulter calling him a faggot, which was just reprehensible.
And you linked to that. You linked in your story to the YouTube clip.
Absolutely, because it seemed like poor judgment, honestly, on his part to feed this particular storyline about himself. And I guess as I took it, you were arguing that I should have refrained from posting that, should have in some way maybe suppressed it because of how it was going to be used by people who didn't like him. And I think, I think this is more about journalistic culture in general, because I think the Times or the Washington Post would have eagerly used that item, although they might have put it in the 19th graph of the story to sort of cover themselves from seeming, or they would have used it like I did as a blog item, because honestly, it isn't a big deal.
Right.
But
what
would you have had me do with that piece of information? I guess was what I didn't quite get.
Yeah, I think that journalists who are covering political candidates in this time in our country, when there's more issues of critical importance that one can possibly ever discuss in a single newspaper column, most of which aren't in Politico, but which are still in the world, I think that journalists ought to make decisions about what actually is important and what isn't. And, I think that journalists covering political candidates probably learn personal information about the candidates all the time that is just simply too petty or too personal or too gossipy or too intrusive to bother printing.
The test is basically whether it's interesting to readers.
I do think that, I do think there's a responsibility on the part of a journalist to say to himself, okay, I know that if I print this story about the Edwards haircut for $400 at a woman's spa, that's going to be picked up by Matt Drudge. And
you just made it worse.
Well, it wasn't a woman. It is at a spa frequented by women.
There were other spas. It's a separate Watergate level scandal.
So I do think there then becomes a responsibility that, okay, well, I know that if I report this story, the only impact that it could possibly have is that, a bunch of right-wing outlets like Matt Drudge, on whom my employer relies for most of its traffic, is going to pick up on it. Or, if that doesn't happen, it's just going to disappear into the ether because it's nothing but petty, inconsequential, meaningless gossip. And I think a journalist who's exercising, let me just finish, a journalist who's exercising responsible judgment about what really is news and what isn't is not going to print that. A journalist looking for not Drudge links is going to print it because it feeds so perfectly into the right-wing character smear on Edwards that he's a sissy and a faggot who cares too much about his hair. And, that's what I think was the problem with your story was its clear effect and I think intent. And it has to be intent because there couldn't be any other in publishing it, was to attract the likes of Matt Drudge and Glenn Reynolds and other right-wing hacks who feed off these kind of attacks that you were feeding and link to them and give the Politico a lot of traffic.
See, the intent, I write a blog, and my basic core audience of, several thousand, I guess, is at its heart Democratic political staffers and then people who are following at various levels of remove the Democratic campaign very closely. And you just post the stuff that you think your audience will be interested in, amused by, and that's what that was. And nobody was laughing harder about this than the other Democratic campaigns. And that's just like an underlying dynamic of this race right now, that on the Republican side, the mud is getting slung intramurally, and the same thing is true on the Democratic side. I'm happy or certainly not. In a day, I don't even want to say that. I don't mind. I'm not going to tell people not to link my stuff or suppress stuff that would be of interest to my readers because I'm concerned of how it's going to be used. With the exception of something that would be used to physically hurt somebody or something like that.
No, but I agree, and you shouldn't do that. I don't think journalists should ever suppress.
That's what I was trying to do.
I don't think journalists should ever suppress any information about any candidate on the grounds that the information will reflect negatively on the candidate when the information is relevant and substantive. when the information is gossipy trash about John Edwards' obsession with his hair, and the only ones who are going to pick it up are people looking to depict him as an effeminate sissy for partisan purposes, then I do think there's a reason to suppress it, not because it hurts the candidate, but because the information is garbage. It's petty. It's the type of trash that degrades our political discourse and that has infected our last two presidential elections. And I do think that's where the journalist has responsibility to make judgment decisions. And I mean, what you're saying is, look, I mean, this is really actually being fed or celebrated by Democrats. I mean, that might be true, but, I'm sure you realize that the only people who link to that story of yours, other than to criticize it as journalistically irresponsible, were right-wing hacks, right?
And that's what works on the web, is people, you link things that hurt your opponents. It's just sort of like, that just seems to be how the web works. But I'm not going to not write another story about John Edwards, actually saying that he, I'm not sure if this is a good example or not, but sort of, I sort of noticed that it was, I think Matt Stoller maybe simultaneously noticed that, but I was among the first to notice that John Edwards had said he doesn't believe there's a global war on terror in the Bush administration sense, and this was linked a bunch on the left by people who don't like Bush. But I mean, like you just can't, and that's a I think seriously substantive policy issue in a different way. It's something I spent a lot more time on, but you just can't make your judgment on what you use based on who it's going to. I mean, that's just how you become a propagandist. You decide what you're going to write based on who it's going to hurt.
I think it was extremely clear about the fact that journalists should never suppress facts because it hurts a candidate where the facts are substantive and relevant, such as John Edwards saying that there should be no war on terror, and that is a fact that might reflect poorly on Edwards in the eyes of a lot of people.
What if Mitt Romney was, sixpencing his hair grease? Would this be a permissible gossip item?
No, and this is what when I said before I want to talk about John Harris, this was the point I wanted to make, and I don't mean I want to talk about John Harris, the individual. I mean, I want to talk about what John Harris and Mark Halpern wrote in their book on this topic.
Read it, because it's good.
Which is, what they said, and I quoted this the last time to you, which is, they wrote about how Drudge rules the world of mainstream journalism, and what they said was that Drudge specializes, that the world that the media freak show is most influenced by a website right out of the Miami apartment of Matt Drudge, the impresario of the attack-based, personality-obsessed politics that is the freak show's signature. And, one of the points that I made to you the last time that I'll make again because it relates to what we're saying is the judgment of a journalist, of a good political journalist is, do I want to be a part of this filthy freak show? Do I want to feed with what John Harris called attack-based, personality-obsessed politics, this circus and carnival that basically is propelling our political system and the way that our journalists discuss the political candidates and the political issues that we face. And if I were you, or if I were anyone, and I looked at what I was writing, and I realized that a lot of what I was writing was fitting into Matt Drudge's twisted and degraded view of the world and the way that he discusses politics and frames and presents it, I would conclude, because I don't see any other conclusion that's possible, that I too was writing personality-obsessed, attack-oriented politics that fits into the freak show, and I would question whether what I was doing as a journalist was really what I ought to be doing, and I don't see any questioning on your part or on the part of other journalists who fit so comfortably into that framework. I mean, is that, the kind of stuff that you really want to be doing?
I mean, first of all, you don't see what we don't write, right? Like, I mean, there's all sorts of stories that would be perhaps juicy. So you'd be very easily to speculate on a blog every day about the sex lives of candidates or something and get links. And I agree with you. There's a line that's obviously beyond it. And, obviously you don't and shouldn't get any credit for the stuff you don't write. At the same time, I think there's like an authentic conversation about these candidates and about politics going on among the people who are very close to the campaigns, first of all, and radiating out, that encompasses both their personalities and who they are and their stances on matters of policy in a very seamless way, because that is in fact kind of the reality in which the candidates live. John Edwards, nobody talks about John Edwards' hair more than John Edwards at the moment. Jokes about it as part of his stump speech. And they present their own personalities as very central to who they are. I think because they think that the American people want that. Maybe that's not true. Maybe the American people are misled. I mean, and there is, I don't disagree with you that there's something discomforting about the way Americans make their political choices based on, the cliches who you want to get a beer with, or that that's a central part of it. But it also seems like there's a wide acknowledgement that Americans and we kind of care who these folks are. And a lot of what you're saying is gossip is about who these guys are. They spend a lot of time talking about and presenting who they are. And I don't think you're expected to take that at face value, from Bush's National Guard service to... And I guess I just want to go... Something we talked about last time, but if you go back and read the coverage of George W. Bush in 1999 and 2000, a lot of stuff that is now really received wisdom about Bush was in Maureen Dowd's column. Stuff about the kind of family drama, about his personal intellectual limits, things that you hear on the left all the time, on blogs that I don't think you're censuring for saying it. That seems useful and relevant, honestly. And Molly Ivins is another writer who, wrote very personal things about him and who he is, and gossipy stuff about his family, but stuff that strikes me as meaningful, because I think it's worth knowing who these guys are.
Yeah, I think the world of psychoanalysis of candidates and addressing their character and their personality traits is an extremely broad one, and within that purview you can have meaningful substantive discussions, or you can have kind of gossipy, attack-based trash.
But you're just calling the stuff you don't like gossipy attack. You're just saying that the stuff you don't like is gossipy attack-based trash, as far as I can tell, and stuff that's negative about. So tell what's some gossipy attack-based trash that's been written about George W. Bush?
About what?
That's been written about George W. Bush.
Yeah,
is there any?
For example, I never write about personal motives.
I know you don't, but does anybody?
Yeah, but I don't think...
Just think of some. Just cite some for me. Some gossipy attack-based trash that's been written about Bush.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff now, for example, that is speculating about whether or not he's drinking again, and whether or not he's separated from Laura Bush and fighting over the fact that he's drinking. I think that's gossipy trash that I don't think belongs in newspapers. Well, there's an example. How many do you want?
That's because there's no then there's no evidence for it. If he were drinking again, would that be news?
I think if the President of the United States, who was a former alcoholic, were drinking again, I do think that would be news. I think that there was evidence he was drinking, but I think that if there were evidence that he were fighting a lot with his wife, I don't think that would be news. I think that would be gossipy trash. I think that if he were getting haircuts more frequently or paying closer attention to how his hair looked or coloring it a little bit, I don't think that would be journalistically relevant.
The only
that
source
would be gossipy trash.
You guys reported that Laura
Who's you guys? You guys.
Salon.
Is it this number?
Right.
Reported at some point, I think that's where I saw it, that Laura Bush got a $700 haircut.
Yeah, I think that's irrelevant. Okay, I think it's irrelevant. I don't think that ought to be reported.
It's not a big deal. I think we've already spent more time talking about Edward's haircut than it deserves, but I don't think that saying something isn't a big deal.
This is the issue that I wanted to raise in terms of what you were just discussing, which is, you were saying that the American people care about these personality-based issues, and this is what journalists do a lot. It's a major fallacy that I think exists among a lot of national journalists, which is...
Blame your audience.
Yeah, journalists will write about things endlessly. They go on television shows and talk about those things so that the news is dominated by them. And then they point to the fact that people care about them as a reason to keep talking about them. And the evidence that people care about them about these things is the fact that they're in the news. And the best example that I ever saw for that was when Roger Simon this week wrote the Politico's 8th item on the Edwards haircut. And he was kind of embarrassed about it, a little sheepish, and he said, look, I don't actually want to write about this anymore, but look, my hands are tied. People care about this. And the evidence that he pointed to as to why showing people care about that was the fact that there was an item in an Iowa newspaper where 324 comments were left in response to one of the Edwards haircut items.
Right,
and that was because Matt Drudge had linked to that story. Right. So what you have is all of the national outright journalists chattering about the story and then citing their own chatter as evidence that people care about it. I don't think people do care.
That was a small error, but I do think, I think one thing that strikes me that I think you're totally right about is that the TV networks, to a degree that always astonishes me, really take their cues from Drudge. And stuff goes on to TV, that on cable news, particularly Fox, but also CNN, and I guess even particularly, I don't know, I don't watch enough to know, but goes on to Fox, CNN, and MSNBC straight off Drudge in a very swift and immediate way.
Right.
And I think, and then trickles down to local news, and I think that because Americans get most of their news from TV, that Yeah, I know. I think that's a really good. That's something Greg Sargent has written a bunch about. Actually, speaking of him. And then I think on the back end, you're right that creates an incentive for print reporters to feed Drudge, and I just think it's an incentive to be resisted. Honestly, I mean, and that's what good reporters do, because in the long run, you want to write things, you want to be credible. But I guess that's. But I mean, in a way, yeah. So there are elements of your kind of general critique that I really agree with.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. But let me ask you this, and let's just think. I want to.
And that's actually straight out of Harris's book too.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, a lot of people misinterpret.
So I think it's the TV
a lot of people
thing
misinterpret what John Harris and Mark Popperin were saying when they, in that Drudge Rules Our World section, that they were celebrating that Drudge Rules Our World.
No, I think if you read it, it's clear that they weren't.
They were saying, here's a major problem with, or here's how. I think it was more descriptive.
I think it was descriptive. Yeah, that's right. But it certainly wasn't celebratory.
No, but nonetheless, I mean, that's the world in which they work, and I think they're cognizant of the fact that Drudge does rule their world, and that if you start a new, online newspaper, a great way to get it boosted is by attracting Drudge links. But let me ask you this. One of the things that I've been doing, and I try not to, focus.
Let me just redisclaim that I don't speak for the Politico and don't even always know what's going on over there.
Okay.
So, just to be totally clear.
And this is sort of Politico detached, actually, so it'll be a new topic. But one of the things I try and do is, I think there's a big difference between the critique of an attack on the press from the right and a critique on an attack on the press from the left. I think the right really is interested in completely discrediting the media and journalists, because they consider the role that journalists perform, which is to check the government, to be actually a detrimental function, that we're in a time of war, and the media should not undermine the government by fulfilling its adversarial function. And I think,
this wasn't. But no, wait a second though, because the right critique of the media was really all about the 1990s and what's left of it. And honestly, their groups, the right-wing media critics, are sort of toothless now. I mean, I guess David Bassi threatened to sue me the other day, but other than that, I can't think of.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the ongoing obsession that the right has with, claiming that there's this, monolithic liberal media that controls our public discourse, and they portray themselves as victims, and Fox News is the necessary antidote to that. I think that the view of the right in the media is that when the media checks the government and acts as an adversarial force against the
So where we left it was Glenn had just raised the question of was talking about conservative media critics and particularly around the war, and I just wanted to insert parenthetically that my impression of the conservative media critics is that they really rose up against particularly the Times and the Post and the networks in the 1990s, and that their worldview is defined by that. So back to you.
Well, and one of the points that you had acknowledged and I think sort of embraced is this predominance of Drudge and his great influence over all sorts of different aspects of the media, which is a point that
well, it's really just a matter of traffic.
In their book too. What's that?
It's a reality of the amount of traffic he drives, which is about 10 times as much as
So,
maybe, the next year, which is basically, Huffington Post is growing and is, I think, probably going to be really important in changing that dynamic.
Well, so this is a point that we started touching on the last time, and I think was one of the more important ones. And a lot of media criticism that comes from the left and from critics of the Bush administration generally about the right-wing bias in the media, I think, gets misinterpreted by journalists, and for that reason, bloggers and journalists kind of talk past each other on this question. Because when bloggers accuse journalists of writing with a right-wing bias, journalists think to themselves, oh, what they're accusing me of is I'm a right-wing ideologue, and that when I go into work in the morning, I set out to promote a right-wing agenda. Because I'm a right-wing ideologue.
This is why I was objecting.
I know that I'm not. What's that?
Right, and this is why I was objecting to your sort of Politico nonsense and our corporate ownership and stuff, just because for that specific reason. Because you were saying that there was something actively conspiratorial afoot.
Ben, let me just finish my point, because I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about it, but I haven't really made it. So let me
No, go ahead.
So, and I mean, I at least know for me, I mean, I'm sure there are some journalists who have a right-wing bias, and I'm sure there are some journalists who have a left-wing bias, who are liberals. But I know for me at least that, I think that not only the criticism I make, but the ones that I hear are more systemic than that. They're not, accusing individual reporters who probably think they're doing a good job and are conscientious of being, the equivalent of Rush Limbaugh, but instead it's a systemic critique based on, number one, things like you just said, that, the importance of Matt Drudge, who is a right-wing ideologue, who serves a right-wing agenda, is so predominant that there's really no equivalent to it. And number two, that, that I think, leaving corporate ownership aside, because we've sort of covered that, but I think that's there as well, but, a huge important part is that journalists rely on people in power and in government in order to get stories. I mean, scoops about what the government is doing come from people who know what the government is doing, who are inside power circles. And for the last 6 years in Washington, and still today, although to a lesser extent, the people who have been in power have been right-wing operatives, people connected to the Bush machine. They've controlled Congress, they've controlled the White House.
As for the previous 8 years,
and so I think a lot of mainstream journalists, like John Harris, Mark Halperin, all of them, I don't mean to single anyone out, have developed comfortable associations with, by necessity, the Republican power structure. And a lot of the bias comes from there as well. So, I don't know, I mean, do you not think that's valid? Don't you think that the predominance of Matt Drudge and Republicans in the Beltway where these reporters function is just inevitably going to influence how they report and how they view the world?
Okay, yeah, and I guess I think that's it's always a danger in journalism, and clearly it was true. I mean, either you're only as good as your sources, or you get too close to your sources, and I think that's always been. Yeah, I totally agree with you. That's always been a huge issue, and something that you sort of have to balance, and in a way that it's editor's job to kind of rein in. I mean, and clearly the coverage of the beginning of the war, particularly. I mean, I don't think anybody disputes that. Was, and I wasn't covering it really. I mean, but it was just incredibly screwed up, and I think everybody at every major paper is sort of thinking about that a lot. And I think you also have seen, and partly, it's another thing about journalism that should bother everybody is the extent to which when a White House is strong, they're able to push the press around, and now that they're very weak, they're getting the shit beat out of them. But it's that's clearly problematic. Maybe that's too strong, but it's the relative strength of the White House and their poll numbers certainly kind of seem to affect the kind of press they get in a way that is. I don't really think a lot of people dispute this stuff though.
Maybe. I mean, journalists who want to break intelligence stories or who want to break military stories or stories involving the White House still have their Republican sources, and whether I think
and as the White House has cracked up,
they're willing to report negatively. But one of the said,
and as the White House has cracked up, it's changed.
What's that?
I mean, there were always people who were talking to Colin Powell, and even in the later first Bush. I mean, people, in a way, it was the unity of the Bush White House that there wasn't vicious infighting for a couple of years, because that's what reporters thrive on.
I think Colin Powell
and now that that's emerged, we're all getting. Sorry, go ahead.
We're having a little problem with our connection. Hopefully it'll improve, but I'm having a little trouble hearing you. But, one of the things that you said that I did hear is that, you had alluded to the fact that the coverage in the run-up to the war was problematic, and you said you don't think anybody really disagrees with that. I know that there are a lot of reporters who do disagree with that, who think that, there was a Judy
Well, I think
that
is now what you're saying is conventional wisdom, I guess is what I mean. That's
right,
conventional wisdom in journalistic circles.
But do you think in journalistic circles it's conventional wisdom that there was a fundamental failure of the function of the press in the lead up to the war? Or do you think the idea is that there were a few reporters here and there, like a Judy Miller, and in isolated cases other reporters who were a bit too credible and didn't do their job, but that by and large it wasn't a fundamental press failure?
I guess I think most people think it was something broader than a couple reporters, but I don't want to speak for most people. That's what I think.
But you think there was a more fundamental failure on the part of the press leading up to the war?
Well, it seems clear, and I thought that God, I can't remember if this was Moyers or somebody talking about Moyers, but it's sort of almost the placement of the stories. I mean, yeah, I think that most reporters agree. Although I'm not, I'm no expert on this.
You can't speak for most reporters, obviously, so it's not really fair to ask you that. But what?
Yeah, and I don't even really speak with particular. I don't even really speak with particular expertise, but but just that reporters trust what they were getting from the White House in terms of weapons of mass destruction, kind of across the board, and were in some degree led by the New York Times on this, and printed it, and it turned out not to be true. Like I don't think anybody disagrees with that.
Why do you think that happened?
I don't know, and I haven't thought about this stuff as much as you, which is not to say that I necessarily agree with you. But I also think it's being corrected, which is sort of not really particularly helpful to people who are in Iraq right now.
This is it's a matter of historical interest, obviously, but I think much more than that, it's a great matter of contemporary interest, and I say that because. In order for reporters,
in a sort of strict journalistic sense.
Let me just finish. In order for reporters to be able to fix the problem, they need to A, believe there is a problem, and then B, understand what the problem is. Otherwise, they can't fix the problem. And so I'm kind of, to me, I think this is the number one issue facing the political press and therefore the American citizenry, which relies on the political press for keeping the government checked. And that's the reason why there's a First Amendment. And that question is, if you begin with the assumption that you say is conventional wisdom, and I agree it's true, whether it's widely accepted or not, I think is a different issue, that there was a fundamental failure on the part of the press being too skeptical or insufficiently skeptical, too believing of White House claims that led us into the Iraq War. Are those defects, those fundamental defects, really ones that are in the past, or are they still dictating how our political press reports on our government? I have strong opinions on that. I don't see how anyone working in journalism wouldn't. And, I guess you are a political reporter. You cover political issues. Do you set out to avoid some of those mistakes? Do you try to think about what those mistakes were and report differently? Or that's why I'm asking.
Of course. I don't cover the White House or this White House or War and Peace, except to the extent that they're central, which they are, to the presidential campaign. But that's a kind of degree of remove. And I think part of your gripe with the Politico is, you sort of come to, we're not centrally covering this stuff, and so, in a way, what you're looking for is hard-hitting coverage of Iraq. You've come to the wrong place, but that's kind of parenthetically. I guess in terms of not trusting this White House and the White House on kind of claims about national security, yeah, I think that is something that everybody's got in mind, but I don't really feel qualified to kind of go theoretically toe-to-toe with you on this one, so maybe we should wind it up.
No, fair enough. Honestly, I think it's a question that I'm not sure one needs expertise on that question as much as, sort of just an appreciation of what the role of the press was, which actually was, kind of ties into what we were talking about before we cut off about the right and the left. What motivates my press criticism, at least, when I write about Politico or anything else, is that I think I have a huge respect for the role that the political press in our country is intended to play. I think it's of vital importance, and I think when it's performed well, it is a very admirable thing to watch and has unbelievably healthy effects in our political process. And my criticism of the media stems from the lack of adversarial and investigative function on the part of the press and sort of this entertainment-driven, accommodation to power that is motivated by a desire to get scoops and which then help careers and drive ratings, or to curry favor with the power structure, which also helps people's career and breaks stories and eviscerates the function of the press. And so, I don't think it's much of an ideological criticism. Oh, they're being too mean to Democrats. They're being too nice to Republicans. The media criticism I hear is about what is the real function of the press as it properly exists, and why isn't it being fulfilled?
Yeah, I guess I just think that there were a lot of different things in that sentence, some of which, which I guess you see, I think, as one cloth, and I think I kind of don't. For example, I think that you can try to be entertaining, write about serious stuff and be entertaining, either, sequentially or simultaneously. I don't really see a problem with that. And let's see, I think I may have lost the thread. There were a lot of different things bundled up in there. I don't know. I don't think most reporters get very far by, being loved by the people you're covering, I don't think is most reporters' goal. And I guess I just think that most reporters come at it from a very different place, which is trying to speak kind of directly and straightforwardly to the people who are reading it, your audience. And when you just can't say that, you said who's going to hurt and who's going to help.
Right. Well, for example, you said earlier, if you want coverage of the war, you don't come to the Politico. I would definitely, agree with that. But what kind of reporting?
You actually get very good coverage.
What are the different kinds of reporting? Like if someone said to you, okay, I see you as a political reporter, so when I go to read what you've written, I expect to find the kind of thing that I would expect the political press to be reporting. But maybe your idea of what you do, or what newspapers like Politico do is different. How would you describe that?
No, I think actually, just parenthetically, you will get very good coverage of the Iraq War debate in Congress, for example, in Politico. I just meant that, if you want to know what's going on the ground in Iraq, you should read papers that have correspondence there. Or inside the Defense Department on a daily basis. But I'm sorry, ask your question again.
No, it's okay. I was sort of, you had alluded earlier to, different kinds of reporting. I think some people would say, look, I'm an investigative reporter. Like, you ask Dana Priest what she does, I think she would say, I cover the intelligence community, and what I try and do is, and military issues, and what I try and do is I try and investigate what the government is doing that they want to keep concealed from us, but that the public ought to know. For example, the government is operating secret sites throughout Eastern Europe out of the reach of the law. I want to find out about that, and then I want to report it in a responsible way. Or, the government is neglecting our veterans at Walter Reed Hospital and is concealing that because they're embarrassed by it and don't want anyone to know, but I want to find that out and disclose that because it's a matter of great public interest, and I want to spark political debate over important issues. How would you describe, what you see your role as a journalist as being, the kind of reporting you do?
I didn't, unfortunately, catch every word you just said, Glenn. And we can go back and just kind of cut it off here if it becomes really incoherent. But I guess, I totally, that's obviously a huge and important function of the press, but it's, it's also, you want to kind of cover these people and kind of accurately portray what they're talking about and kind of who they are. And, when they're telling you things that are, not consistent with who they are, to reveal that. And to really kind of find out what the difference, most, I think, importantly, campaigns, to find out what the differences are between them on every level. That seems to me the central issue, particularly on really important issues of policy, like, I guess one of my frustrations with some of the left criticism is that it's almost as though you read Drudge, find the stuff that is on Drudge, and then are like, all their stuff is on Drudge. But when in fact we're doing all sorts of stuff, I'm writing 10 items a day, plus, stories here and there, that, are kind of most of what I do. For example, an article about Joe Biden's stance on whether there is or is not a global war on terror.
But the stuff that you write that gets linked on Drudge is by far the most significant. I don't know what your readership is without Drudge links, but I know that with
significant to who? You're the one taking Drudge's standard here, not me.
No, I'm just saying.
I think you're the one. You're the one letting Drudge be the judge of what's significant here, not me. I'm trying to talk to my audience.
Matt Drudge, I'm happy to say, has never actually found anything that I've written to fit within his personality-obsessed, attack-oriented freak show. So, I'm not actually using Matt Drudge as my standard. Your pieces are the ones that are linked to by Matt Drudge with an alarming frequency. So I don't think that criticism is really accurate. But, and I realize that we do write a lot of stuff that isn't.
But you kind of see the circularity of this, right?
What's that?
I was just saying, do you see the circularity of this? You're sort of taking this tiny proportion of my stuff that is linked on Matt Drudge and of Politico stuff, saying, and then using Drudge's standard of interest, saying this is the most important stuff. It's very hard to argue with that.
Right. I think it's not just that the Drudge.
And I think in a way you're buying.
I've written about political articles before that were linked by Drudge, like the 8th Edward's Haircut story by Roger Simon wasn't linked by Drudge, but I wrote about that. But obviously, stories that get linked by Drudge and the Politico are the ones that have the greatest impact, and they give and it's the extraordinary frequency of the Drudge links that I think reveals what kind of stuff the Politico is turning out. But let me give you the last word because our connection is a little faulty at this point, but it's an improvement over the last time when we didn't get recorded. So let me give you the last word, and we've covered a lot of topics, and we can call it a day for now.
Sorry, you said are you giving me the last word here?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we. I'm spent. I think that was all right. All
right.
Yeah, and I appreciate your keeping it civil, and my keeping it civil.
Yeah, no, I think it was
what I mean?
Spirited, but interesting and civil, and I'm glad for that too.
Yes, since we're both known as such uncivil people. Anyway, thanks.
I agree.
See you.
All right, Ben. Nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you.